So they do like us, or they want us to test disaster recovery, and there's a couple of ways that you can do this. A role swap means you actually fail everything in your organization over to the disaster recovery site. I don't know a lot of shops that do this on a regular basis. The ones who do tend to be big financial companies or 24/7 manufacturing firms where they really do want to make sure that this thing keeps right on going when they fail to DR. So they actually run out of DR for hours or days. When I was at the $7 billion company, we would fail our entire data center over to our DR data center and run there for a weekend and then fail everything back. It takes a huge amount of manpower. You learn things every time you do those failovers. And it would usually take us the week before and the week after just to set everything up perfectly and then go through everything we learned in the aftermath. In an isolated DR test, what that means is I'm going to go bring production live. I'm going to go bring DR live, but I'm not taking down production. With isolated DR testing, it assumes that I did lose the whole production data center, but instead I'm just going to go work over in the isolated DR data center. I'm going to sever the network line, and I'm going to put my people over working in DR to bring it up as if it was live, but I got to make sure no real data goes into it. And during that time, when I'm doing an isolated DR test, I'm running without a parachute. That doesn't, running without a safety net makes more sense because running with a parachute slows you down. But I'm running without a DR site because if I take this thing down to go bring it live, then I may not be caught up to sync with production. Shakawat asks, does the DR test apply with log shipping but not always on? No, this applies with always on as well. You'll learn a lot of interesting things about always on this week. So then the DR test timeline, the way I start, and this could be, any of these could be multiple days, but generally day one starts by isolating the DR data center to make sure no work goes into it, like no production customer sales or shipped orders go into it. Day two, I'm going to bring DR live. Day three, I'm going to put DR back the way it was, like continuing to get data from log shipping or always on availability groups. And then on day four, we're going to sit around a conference room table and talk about what we learned and what we could do better, like what changes to our infrastructure we need to make in order to survive this next time. Now, doing an isolated DR test. Now, with a role swap, it's really just all hands on board. Everybody goes into a conference room and everybody works full tilt because it takes everyone that you have in order to fail over to DR. But in an isolated DR test, when I'm really just bringing DR live, oh my goodness, someone says, or Billy says, are the slides updating? They were not updating, Billy. I'm glad you caught that. Everyone else just assumed we were trucking along via talking. All right, I'm going to show you the slides. So we're on testing DR. You guys have the PDFs anyway. But I talked through the differences between these two tools, or two techniques. We talked about what isolated DR testing assumes. We talked about the timeline of an isolated DR test. Now we're going to talk about the mechanics that actually happen during an isolated DR test. Remember, role swap, everybody just goes all hands on deck and does their thing. With an isolated DR test, I take one person from each team, like Windows, development, storage, SQL Server, and I throw them off-site. They have no access to production. They are not allowed to touch production. It's as if production got hit by a meteor, the SAN is down, whatever. They have to bring the DR site online, and they need to document what went wrong as they're working. When I say document, I kind of mean the same kind of documentation that we had aboard sailboats when I used to go sailboat racing. I don't go sailboat racing anymore. I had an awful incident where we came in dead last in a 300-mile race, and I don't ever want to go through that mess again. But when you go underneath deck on a racing sailboat, there's a little laminated sheet that shows you where everything is on the boat. And this kind of laminated sheet is designed for sailors. It's designed for people who know what this equipment does. For example, the map doesn't say what an EPIRB is, but if you're a sailor, you understand what an EPIRB is. You just need to know to go here in order to get it, or here's where the tethers are, or here's where a fire extinguisher is. When I'm documenting what happens in a DR test, I'm documenting For someone who's got the same level of skills that I do, go here to get the backup files, run a restore, but use these particular options. This server's tricky because it's got replication involved. I'm not going to list every single thing you need to do because that takes forever and it's very brittle documentation. Every time you have a change to your infrastructure, that documentation immediately falls apart. I want the documentation to be flexible enough to survive small upgrades to my infrastructure. I'm also writing it out for, if I can, systems administrators. I want Sam, the system admin, to be able to sub in for me whenever possible. Because when a real disaster hits, often you have 10 people in the data center with very different experience levels. The exchange guy may finish his failover in the span of 20 minutes and go, all right, who can I help? What else can I do to make this easier for people? And if I have a checklist where I can say, hey, go follow these 10 steps, go, and just come to me when you have problems, he can be bringing up more of my SQL servers that I wasn't able to bring up. Now, for the rest of this session, the things that I'm going to talk about work exactly the same, whether I'm role swapping, taking the whole infrastructure over to DR, or if I'm running an isolated DR test where I just sever the network lines and I have people go work over in the DR test. The first thing that I'm going to do, when you're working during an emergency, you look at your watch and you're like, oh my God, there went 2 hours. I don't remember what I did. So what I want to do is I want to start a shared Google Doc. If you've never seen Google Docs before, it's like multiplayer word processing. All of you can edit in the same doc at the same time. You can even drag in screenshots, and it shows the history of what everybody did at different times. You can add comments to what other people say. So what I'm going to do is every 10 minutes, I'm going to have an alarm go off. If we're all in the same room, we just set it up on a phone so that the alarm goes off. If we're on a conference bridge, someone just tracks us resetting the alarm. And when that alarm goes off, everyone stops what they're doing and just makes a quick note in the doc about what they were doing at that point in time. I'm working on the production web OLTP SQL server. I'm having problems getting replication up and running over to the reporting box. The idea being that I want to be able to go back at a period of time and say, all right, 30 minutes into the test, what SQL servers were available? 45 minutes into the test, what SQL servers were available? What parts of going live in DR took us the longest? What were the things that were broken for the longest period of time that maybe if we put a little thought into, we wouldn't have to have this long of an outage next time? This is what we go back through and regroup on after the role swap or after the isolated DR test. And the kinds of things that we find, first off, is an outdated inventory. Very few shops have an inventory of servers, services, and people, so that I can say, everybody has these individually. They have a list of servers, they have a list of apps, and they have a list of people, but they don't know how they tie together. And I need to be able to have a prioritized list of business services that I need to get back up and running, who I call when those services are up and running, and what servers are involved. I kind of just have a vague list of the servers that I have out there with maybe some of the databases on there. You learn horrifying things when you go to do a failover and you don't really have bulletproof lists of databases and contact people. I also don't have a centralized status dashboard. There's no place in my organization where people can go look to see everything that was up right now or is not up right now. And instead, people keep running into the room and going, where are we at on SharePoint? Where are we at on the data warehouse? Where are we at on the website? When I have real disaster recovery role swaps, I like to station a program manager or a product manager out at the door, and they stop people from coming in. And they say, all right, well, based on our last tests, I'm going to jump back a slide. Based on our last test, it was 1 hour before the website was online. Don't come up here in less than an hour. You keep back waiting. After the first hour, you can come in and ask us what the status is on the website, but not until then, because you're only going to slow us down. People always immediately want to ask, well, I need my stuff to come up first. This is the order that we've rehearsed doing this in. If you want something, go write it down. We'll do it the next time we go do this. But for right now, we need to focus on the thing we've done before. Outdated contact inventories is the next thing we find. When we're doing tests, it's easy. Everybody's in the same room with you. You know exactly where somebody's at. When a hurricane hits, you may not have everyone's personal cell phone numbers. You may have outdated copies of their cell phone numbers. You may not have their family numbers to check in on them and see how they are. You also may not have an even single sheet of all your vendors that you need to go contact. One of my favorite instances, several of us went off-site to the DR data center in order to fail over. And when we got to the DR data center, none of us were on the contact list of people who were allowed to walk into the DR data center. Security team just looked at them and goes, nope, the only people who are allowed in are this person, this person, this person, and this person. You're going to have someone call in your organization and update this list. Look, I don't have anybody's contact number to go call. Just let us in. Also, we've had instances where I've been on the phone with my boss. My boss has said, look, I know the data warehouse in DR doesn't have enough power, but we lost our primary data center. You need to go live in DR. I know we've only got 64 gigs of RAM. Go order another 512 gigs of RAM from the vendor right now so that when it gets in, we can put it in. And I'm like, who's our vendor? Do I need an Amex? Is he going to bill us? What does that process look like? This is typically managed by a support member of the team, so like a receptionist, an administrative assistant who works in the IT team who could just maintain this list of vendors. From a tech point of view, you usually see that firewalls, VPNs, DNS, and DHCP are usually a little bit wonky over in DR. VPN is the classic example. Everyone thinks they're going to VPN into production. But then when production is gone, we may not have enough capacity for VPN access over on the VPN side. Firewalls may be misconfigured and not allow traffic out. So, for example, we've had instances where the website was up and running in DR, but no one could get to it until someone redid all our firewall settings. My wife brought in a fresh pot of coffee here, so I'm like, woo, all right. Well, not a whole pot, just a single cup, obviously. She made a fresh pot. Monitoring software over in DR, people usually think monitoring isn't important enough to do disaster recovery on. Guess what's the first thing you want to know when you fail over? Are my servers up? Guess what fails all the time over in DR? All your jobs, like your backup jobs and CheckDB jobs, things are misconfigured. Instead, you're dealing with hundreds of emails and you have no idea what dashboard you should go look at to see what's going on. People complain about performance the instance that they fail over to DR. And then backup targets with enough space. This is interesting. People often just do backups, say, and only keep the last 3 days on disk. They say, oh, we sweep the rest off to a virtual tape library like a data domain. Then when we fail over to DR, they often don't have enough space to keep more and more backups live real time because everyone's trying to do restores at exactly the same time. We often don't have good communication channels. For example, link may be down. If you deal with a cloud service like O365 and you're using their services or Slack or Google Hangouts, I like those offsite services because they don't have anything to do with us. But I want a chat that involves just text chats, not necessarily audio video, because during a DR, audio conference bridges are my nightmare. Everybody's like, what's the status on blah, 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 blah. How are we doing with whatever? You hear 4 kids in the background and people chewing Doritos and all these things. So I'm huge about text status rooms, so anything like Slack or HipChat where we can just all type in there and keep posted on where everybody's going. DR workloads are often different. I'm not going to go into detail here. Just know that your backup throughput needs to be tested over in DR as well. Often people will use older generation hardware in DR, not understanding that's actually where you need your fastest backup equipment. Because guess what everyone wants to do at the same time is do a restore. The last thing I'm going to talk about for testing HA and DR is monitoring. For monitoring disaster recovery, I really just need to know if we can fail over or not. Is the business going to be okay with the amount of data that I'm about to lose? And I don't like the DMVs. The DMVs are different for every feature in SQL Server. AGs, log shipping, database mirroring, replication. And it's hard for people to understand what all the different DMVs mean and how up to date they are when I lose my primary. But you know what is up to date? Your tables inside the database. What I like doing is every database that I need to move around from one place to another, inside that database, I'm going to create a Canary table. And I call this Canary, I'm not the first person to call this. We call them Canary tables, as in canary in the coal mine. There's this basic old thing where if you were in a coal mine, you would bring a bird down into the coal mine, and if the bird died, that meant there was too much CO2 in the air, and you had to get out of the coal mine as quickly as possible. I'm going to create a Canary table inside my database, and it's only going to have one row. It's just going to have the database name and the current date time. And then I'm going to set up an agent job that every minute updates that record. Now, the update is only going to work on the primary server, but I'm going to be able to read the secondary servers, and when I see the date time in there, I instantly know how old the data is. I don't know anything about replication latency or database mirroring or always-on availability groups. All I care about is where am I at in terms of point in time? Is this a fairly recent database? Or was replication broken and this thing is like 3 days old? You'll notice that I'm using UTC date in here. One of my favorite posts on that is called the worst server setup mistake you can make. You want all your servers running in UTC. This is something that's easy for a consultant to just say casually, run your servers in UTC. But it usually is a huge cultural shift for people. Just know I am planting this seed in you to make you a better database administrator later. Down the road, when your sysadmins ask, why aren't we running everything in UTC? You can just say, I agree. That is something that we should be doing. This blog post has all these things in here that say use UTC, all of them link to different blog posts from sysadmin companies, server vendors, app vendors that all explain why the servers should be running in UTC. Classic example with this scenario with the Canary table, what happens if my servers are in different time zones? I don't want to know get date because it could be in any time zone depending on which time zone my primary had been in. What this lets me do is it lets me quickly check latency on a readable secondary before I fail over. Same thing with logship secondaries. Doesn't work with database mirroring when the principal is no longer reachable, though. It's super lightweight to just update that one record every minute. Then I can trend latency. I can see on my secondaries how far behind they are in terms of seconds. And if I want to alert, hey, if any rows show up from this query, I know I have a problem. If things haven't updated in the last 5 minutes, this secondary table is way far behind. Now, this only works when the secondary is actually readable. If you can't read the secondary, you can't really check to see how far behind it is. But that's what's perfect for DR testing. When the manager comes in and says, we need to fail over to DR right now, I can give them a list of all our database date times and how far behind they are. And say, are you really sure? Because I don't have a way to back out of this. Woo! Talked a lot about a lot of stuff in this module. We talked about how to test high availability before you go live, and the 3 ways that you want to test it is you want to test a planned failover with data loss, an unplanned failover with some data loss, and then a planned resync back with 0 data loss. And we talked about how you test DR on an ongoing basis, how you can either do a role swap or an isolated DR test, both of which are great. It's just a cultural choice amongst companies as to which one they want to do. And then how you monitor how far behind you are using Canary tables. Remember to build the documentation with each other, with your entire team, in things like Google Docs so that you can all type together, planning for the next failover. Then whenever a real disaster strikes, you can just go grab that Google Doc and start trucking right on through it, understanding exactly what you need to do when. one of my favorite DBAs, she managed always-on availability groups by herself, only DBA in the shop. She had a couple of sysadmins with her, and she had, for just one of her SQL servers, she had this mission-critical production always-on availability group, and she had a 156-page Word doc. 156-page Word doc on what she needed to do whenever she failed over from one node to another, because she had to check things like linked servers, replication, her reporting setup. It was very ambitious and huge.